So welcome to Module 1, Evaluating and Implementing Technologies in K-12 Virtual Education. In this module, we're going to be focused on discussing how you can evaluate technologies or make the right choices for yourself in using technologies in your virtual K-12 teaching. And we're going to help you apply that criteria to a couple of examples so that you can get a sense of the best ways to not only evaluate but then implement those technologies. This should be your framework for how you review the technologies through the rest of the course so that you can get a good sense of how you may want to make the right choices about your options available and how those choices and how you implement those choices can positively impact your teaching. So there are 4 dimensions of evaluating a particular technology or trend in using a technology. The first dimension is learning effectiveness. We'll talk about each of these more specifically. But really, learning effectiveness is about how well does it actually impact the learning. The second dimension is functionality and technical requirements. So does it actually do what you need it to do in the right ways? And can it work within your environment, in your school, in your classroom? Can it work on your students' devices at a distance? You want to make sure that just technically it's a feasible technology for you to use. The third dimension is accessibility. Because students come with all sorts of abilities and all sorts of experiences and all sorts of access to technologies, you want to make sure that what you choose, all students can use as equally as possible. Now, there will be some cases where students have a learning disability or a physical disability that they may need to modify that technology. But knowing that going into when you choose a specific technology to use is really important. And you want to evaluate the accessibility of those technologies. And then finally, you want to understand who the company is or the provider is or the individual that created that particular technology and how well do they support that technology. Because that becomes important, especially when you're trying to embed a particular technology in a lesson. You would hate for it to no longer be supported or not have great resources should you get into an issue using that technology. So in this module, we're going to actually give you questions that you can ask yourself as you're evaluating these technologies. And let's start with learning effectiveness. So a couple of questions to ask yourself are, how relevant is that tool to your particular goals of the learning activity? Or more importantly, how relevant is the skill that students will get from using that tool to your learning outcomes? And what we mean by these questions is the technology something that in that particular discipline or domain or career that a student might very specifically need to use? I think of chemistry as an example and a Bunsen burner. If a student's going to become a chemist, they're going to study chemistry in school, if they're going to want to do anything related to a medical field where they're doing research, they probably need to learn how to use a Bunsen burner. We can think about that as a technology. Well, if your students are virtual, how do they get that skill? Well, there are some really great simulations out there that help them understand how to use that, and even some great ways to get them tools and technologies in their hands to do that as well. So you want to think how relevant that skill is. Think about writing and how important blogs could be in writing. Not that blogs are an important venue for publishing, but they do help students practice and get feedback in their writing and in crafting ideas and stories and thoughts. So thinking about how well those match is important. It's also important to think about whether or not the tool can improve learning. We talked about this at the outset. So you want to ask yourself, is the tool making a difference? If it isn't, it may not be worth it to use unless it's helping to engage students, which is what we'll talk about next. But you want to make sure that you're always doing something better with the technologies, or at least doing something equal but giving students access that they may not have had before when implementing technology. So engagement. Engagement's a big one. A lot of teachers talk about, I'm going to use a technology because it's going to engage my students. I want to use Facebook because they're already on Facebook and they're already engaged in Facebook. Well, when you think about engagement, or you ask yourself this question about will this engage students in new or more effective ways, you need to make sure that you're thinking about students using that particular technology in your learning context. So for example, my Facebook story, teachers always wanting to use it, or a lot of teachers wanting to use it because students are already using it, but they're using it socially. They're not necessarily using it to learn. And will they actually be engaged by using it to learn? Or will they be more turned off by using it in a learning environment because it's not how they want to use Facebook in their own personal lives? Now, the final question to ask yourself is, will it provide you with insight, or will it give you important data for you to determine how effective the learning is? And this becomes important because if you think about technologies that can give you insight into when did a student watch something, when did they click on something, how long did they watch something, or how often did they participate in discussions. If you can see that data in an aggregate, and then you can align that to how well students are performing, you can start to make some decisions about whether or not your activities and lessons are successful, and where students may need more help or less help depending on their performance. The second category of ways to evaluate technology is functionality and technical requirements. Questions to ask yourself when thinking about functionality and technical requirements is, how available is the tool? And particularly, what does it cost? Is it free? Will it remain free? Is it one of those tools where you use it, but you can only use the very, very basic parts of the tool and then you have to subscribe? Will your students have to subscribe? And are there any copyright concerns associated with using that particular technology that you should be concerned about? You should also ask yourself, if it isn't free, is the cost worth it? Is it appropriate for my setting? Is it appropriate for me to ask students to pay for something? Is it appropriate for me to pay for something, or my school to pay for something? And is the cost actually something that will derive value back to the learning effectiveness in the long run? You should also be asking yourself, is it an intuitive tool? Because the last thing you want to do is get wrapped up in how to use the tool in your lessons. You want students to use the tool to dig into the lessons. Now, my one caveat on this question, asking yourself this question, is that if it is a particular technology particular to a discipline, perhaps you're a photography teacher, students need to know the nitty-gritty of using a camera, and they may not come in knowing that, or it may not even be intuitive. Well, that's okay, because they need that experience in addition to how to use that camera in order to be successful. So there are some places where it's okay if the technology isn't intuitive because they need to learn it. But in general, you want to make sure that the technologies are intuitive. And we all have a good gut sense about that, and let me tell you, our students will tell us very quickly if it's intuitive or not. You should also ask yourself if you should administer the tool. If you have to administer it, is it easy, right? So if you have to create accounts for students, particularly younger students, there are some technologies that you can have students play with on the internet and use and implement in your teaching and learning. But you do need to create their own accounts. You need to manage their access. And is that easy? Are you able to do that? Is it time-consuming or not? You want to be thinking about that. Oftentimes we forget that. We get so excited about the end-user experience, the student experience, that we forget what it's going to be on our shoulders to actually manage that. And we need to make sure that the cost-benefit analysis is done on that administrative burden. And then finally, you should ask yourselves, can you actually monitor student work? Can you see what students are doing? Particularly if any of that work is public, you want to make sure you can protect your students at all times. And can you monitor it easily? Can you see what they're doing? Can you make sure students are using it appropriately and growing and learning with that technology? The third category is accessibility. In this case, you want to make sure that your students can as equally as possible access the tool or a relevant equivalent to the tool. So you need to ask yourself that. Knowing your student population, can they get to it? If it's internet driven and you are in a country where internet access is not pervasive in students' homes, but mobile technology is, there are a number of African countries that is the case, then perhaps you want to make sure you're using a mobile tool as opposed to an internet-based tool. But just asking yourself, what do my students actually have access to at home, particularly if they're fully virtual, or in my classes if it's blended? And how can I make sure that that access remains the same for all of my students? You also want to ask yourself, does it require any special equipment? And if it does require special equipment, what what would it take to get that special equipment into your students' hands? I think of 3D printers. Not every student, if you're teaching virtual, is going to be able to have a 3D printer in their home. But if you are in a community where there are local 3D printers at libraries, or they can go into a school for a lab and do 3D printing, then it makes sense. But thinking about that, asking yourselves about that, becomes important when looking at accessibility. You also want to ask yourself if it's a public resource, and if it is a public resource or a fully public technology, can you make it private or protect your students' privacy? It's so important to be able to do that, particularly their data. And so thinking about how do students create accounts, how do they access it, and what happens to their data becomes really important. And then finally, you want to think about, is the tool actually scalable? Can you have 40 students in the tool all at the same time and it's okay? Can you make sure that it's always available and reliable so that depending on when students may want to use the particular technology, they can? And is it really appropriate in its help resources and support resources for your students? So can students, if they're working on this at home at night, particularly if they're entirely virtual, can they actually get access to help, or can you provide them with the kind of help that they need? And this leads into our final category, the company or the producer of that technology. You want to ask yourself, if the tool is created by some third party, is that third party actually stable? Will they be around? Can you continue to use it? Particularly if you take time in building the lesson and setting up content in the lesson or lessons, you want to make sure that you can continue to use that, at least for the semester, but preferably in the longer haul. You also want to ask yourself, are there permissions around that particular tool that can be set so that students can have access to that tool in an ongoing fashion, and that students' privacy are protected? So do they have tools built in, and does the company care about that? That becomes really important. You want to ask yourself, if the tool is open source, and open source for those of you that don't know what that is, that means that you can go download the tool for free. It's a community free tool, and that's a very simple definition of open source. If it is open source, do you actually have the expertise to support it? So there are a couple of cases with technologies we're going to talk about that you can actually download and run those technologies, but do you have the skills, the environment, the computer to do that is a good question. You also want to ask yourself, do these tools plug into other technologies? When we get into talking about learning management systems and virtual learning environments, this is going to become important because lots of technologies can plug into them. And you want to make sure you're using them so you can create a seamless learning environment for your students. And then finally, you want to ask yourself about the kinds of best practices and help resources available with that technology and through that company. Do they already provide a lot? And is it specific to K-12? There will be technologies that you're going to want to use that may not be driven towards K-12, but communities of teachers have risen up and created great resources for you to think about how to build lessons and how to support the use of that technology. And in those cases, that's a really great technology to use. But asking yourself those questions become very important. So those were just a set of questions to ask. Let's think about this as an example. Google Hangouts. Hopefully most of you have experienced Google Hangouts. It's basically Google's version of Skype, but a very simplified internet-based approach. And in that case, Google Hangouts is a technology that you may want to use as an example. Well, some of the strengths in thinking about the questions that we just asked are the company is clearly stable. So from a company producer perspective, it's very strong. There are lots of examples for how to use Google Hangouts and specific to K-12 education. There is a lot of ways to protect students through identities, through accounts, through settings, and even through spaces. You can make things private if you need to. And Google is very keen to accessibility. So if you do have any students that have particularly physical disabilities or things like hearing impairments, and they need to be able to modify their Google environment, they can in order to accommodate. It's also free, which is a very good point. But let's think about some of the challenges that might come into using Google Hangouts. It does require, if you're going to use, obviously, voice and video, a good mic and a good video web camera. At least a decent one for students to interact with. It requires good bandwidth. You can use it on mobile devices, but some of those tools are limited on a mobile device. But you want to make sure you've got the bandwidth, either the cell bandwidth if you're using it on a mobile device, or definitely the internet bandwidth if you're using it on your computer. And that's important for your students. They may not have that access. Now, while Google Hangouts is integrated in a lot of its other technologies, sometimes it's hard to get it in separate non-Google technologies. And is that important? Is your district a Microsoft user, and is it hard to get Hangouts to embed into a Microsoft environment? May or may not be, depending on how that environment is set up. But that could be a challenge with Google Hangouts. And then finally, one of the big challenges with Google Hangouts is there's some limitations to scalability. As you'll discover in this course, we're going to do a Google Live Hangouts on Air, and in that case, we can have lots of people join, hundreds and hundreds of people join, but not everybody can speak. Only up to 10 people can speak. In small Google normal Hangouts sections, you have to be careful with how many students and how much speaking and video transmission that you're actually using. So that was an example of how to use those questions to help make decisions around your technologies. So thinking about this, it's time to apply and reflect on what we just discussed. As part of your virtual program, and this is a hypothetical situation, your students have all been provided laptops. So they all have access to laptops, and fairly robust laptops. You would like to find a few good games for students to use on those laptops to help them better learn world geography. What are some of the kinds of technologies that you would look at, and what are the questions or challenges that you would ask yourself related to those technologies? How would you make sure that that specific technology was a good choice, or what might you be careful with as you look to implement that technology?